And today we're going to talk about boilerplates, grids, and frameworks. And there's a bit of a crossover between all these things. The lines are a little bit blurred between them. But essentially what they're all about is starting points for web projects for you. So up until now, probably most of the web projects that you've done, you've written pretty much everything from scratch. We've already looked a little bit at using some external third-party code when we looked at using normalize.css. Okay, and all the things I'm going to talk about today are kind of just extensions of that. So clearly a lot of people have done a lot of web projects over the years, and there's obviously certain things, and I'm sure you've noticed that there's always a bunch of setup stuff that you do every single time that doesn't really change much. So the first category of these, the boilerplate code, is kind of to deal with that. They're essentially a starting point for a new web project that sets up a bunch of things so that you don't have to do it every time you create a new project, and so it just gets you developing a bit quicker. So the one that I'm going to show you is called HTML5 boilerplate, and there's a link to it here under this heading. I'll let it load up. Okay, so essentially what this is it's a set of files that are a starting point for a web project that a lot of experienced people in web design and web development have kind of decided is a good starting point for a web project. And you can download it here with this button, which I will do, and then I'll just show you what it is. So it downloads as a zip file. We extract it, and I'll just open up the files in my code editor so we can have a look at what it is. Okay, so you'll notice it's essentially a folder with a whole bunch of files in it. So there's a bunch of CSS files, and you can see they've included normalize.css, and then they've included a main.css file, which has some more basic styles set up, and then a area down here for you to put your own CSS code in. It's got a JavaScript folder which has some common JavaScript files that are often used in web projects. So jQuery is a JavaScript library that we'll be learning about a bit later, and Modernizer, this is a JavaScript file that allows us to detect various HTML5 feature support in different browsers. This plugins.js is just another one. Essentially all this does is there's a JavaScript function that you can call in a lot of browsers by using the console object, and it allows you to output information to the console section of your developer tools here. Okay, so what you can do is if you're trying to debug your JavaScript, anytime you want to output the value of something at some point in the program, you can output it here. And we will learn more about that when we talk about JavaScript. But essentially all this file does is make sure that function exists on all browsers, because older browsers don't have it, and if you have calls to that in an old browser, it can break the JavaScript code. Okay, so we don't need to worry so much about exactly what they do, but they're JavaScript code that is quite common to a lot of web projects. Then we have a index.html file. Okay, and this is basically an empty, well, in content-wise, a fairly empty HTML file that's just been set up for you to start with. And so you'll notice that it does things like it already links to the CSS files and also the JavaScript files. Okay, if I actually open this up and look at it in the browser, you'll notice that content-wise it's empty, okay? It just has this single HTML line there, which is basically just for you to figure out where to start putting your own HTML code in there. Okay, so it's essentially just the starting point, so you don't have to go and write all this scaffolding when you start it. And it's done in such a way that, again, because a lot of experienced web developers have sort of decided this is the best way to write your HTML document, lots of us tend to overlook things like the correct tags that need to go in our head section of our document and so forth. And so these are all taken care for you in kind of what's considered best practice already with this. So, and you can see what all of these do if you go and look at the documentation section on the HTML5 boilerplate code website, sorry. And so you can see down here it tells you all of the things that it puts in the HTML, okay, and the reason that it puts those in. So it talks about things to make things work better on versions of Internet Explorer, things like the mobile viewport, and all these other sorts of things, okay? And it has similar documentation for the CSS and the JavaScript and whatever else is included there. So if you're interested as the reason why they've included any of these things, or you don't understand what they do, you can always go and look at the documentation and see the reasons why. You can also see that down here, as this comment says, they've included some code for Google Analytics. So it's very common if you have a web project to have some sort of analytics linked to it so that you can see how many people are visiting your site and so forth. And the most popular one of those is Google Analytics. And so they've just put the script in here that allows that to work with your website. So again, you don't have to go and do that setup manually yourself every time you create a new web project. Now, obviously the code exactly as it is isn't going to suit every project. It's sort of a starting point. So just because there's something in there, there's no reason that you have to use it. If, for example, I have no intention of ever using Google Analytics, then I can simply just delete that from the file. Okay, but it's still quicker for me to have all the rest of the stuff that I do need and delete the stuff that I don't, and to go and create everything from scratch. They also give you a default 404.html page, which is the page that comes up whenever you go to a URL that doesn't exist. It reverts to this. Okay, and then there's a bunch of other files in the root of the folder here, and these top three here, you don't really need to worry about too much. These Git ones are basically instructions for version control software. You don't really need to worry about those. The htaccess file, again, you don't really need to worry too much about that, but that's a file which on an Apache web server, which is most of the web servers that you'll use, you can just give instructions for how the web server operates. But again, you don't really need to worry too much about that. You can see that it's included things like Apple Touch icons. Okay, and if we look at that, essentially it's just a placeholder image which you can replace, but it's already in the correct dimensions. That would be used in the case where if you've ever been browsing a website on your mobile phone, and if you know that you can save a bookmark and save it to the home screen, and then it uses an image for the icon to directly link to that website, then you'll find that that's the name of the file that is required to use that icon. So if you need something like that, you can use that. If you don't need it, you can just delete it. Similarly, it's got a favicon.ico, which is, again, a little image that's used for representing the website, and you'll see that used in websites. It usually appears in the tab or the address bar next to it, so that's the favicon, and it's a 16 by 16 pixel, sorry, 32 by 32 pixel icon, and that gets used there, and also when you bookmark a page. So just little things, and it's just there as a placeholder so that you already know the correct dimensions. You don't have to go and look it up. You can simply just open that file, edit it, and replace it, and have your own icons. These humans.txt and robot.txt are instructions for search engine web crawlers. Again, you don't really need to worry too much about that. These tile.png and tilewide, in conjunction with this browser config.html, are essentially icon things, but they're for the Windows 8 and Windows Phone interface. If you know the tile interface where it has all the icons. Again, if you want to have a shortcut to a website that appears on there, you can define how those icons will look in various different sizes on that interface as well. So basically that's the whole idea. They give you all those options. If you want to use them, you replace them. If you don't, you can just ignore them or delete them. But as you can see, if this is the amount of code that needs to be written to set up most new web projects, and you're saving quite a lot of time by starting with this rather than creating it from scratch every single time. So that's boilerplate code, and the HTML5 boilerplate is, as opposed to a lot of other frameworks and stuff we'll talk about where there are lots of different options, pretty much this is the standard boilerplate code that people use for an empty project if they're not using a more extensive framework. One other thing I should mention is you can, on the web page here, there's a link, beside the download link, there's a link to get a custom build. Wait for it to load again. I might just disconnect and reconnect to my internet. Hopefully it goes a bit quicker. Okay, but anyway, while that's reconnecting, so that links you to a site called initializer.com, which essentially allows you to customize the download of that HTML5 boilerplate code. Okay, that's reconnected now. And you've got a few different options here. So starting from the leftmost one, this is modifying the basic version of the HTML5 boilerplate code. And if you click on that, you can add or remove features to and from the download that it will provide you. So let's say you don't want to use the Google Analytics, you can just uncheck it there and download it. It's pretty much the same as just deleting that code that I did, but I guess this is even a slightly quicker way again. And there's also other options you can add. Okay, and there'll be documentation that explains all of that as well. You can see there's docs linked here. And then these two others kind of extend upon that. So that the HTML5 boilerplate standard code by itself doesn't make any dictation about responsive design, so it still leaves all of the responsive design up to you. Okay, but there is this version here which will actually add responsive breakpoints to it as well. I need to refresh this page. Unfortunately, it's going a bit slow, but anyway, that's essentially what it does. It adds on top of the standard HTML5 boilerplate the option to include, essentially in your CSS, predefined media queries for breakpoints for you. So you can add that to it. And then this third one here will actually include the Bootstrap framework, which we'll look at in a moment, along with the HTML5 boilerplate framework. So that's how you can customize that further. But that's all I really want to say about the HTML5 boilerplate. The next thing I want to talk about is grid frameworks. So grid frameworks came about as, I suppose, a conceptually, hopefully easier way to think about laying out content on your page without so much having to worry about what needs to be floated, what needs to be display inline, display block, and all of this sort of stuff. So back in the bad old days of web design, okay, it was popular, it was common to lay out content on the page using HTML tables, and really we can't fault people for doing that back then, because there was no other way of doing it. CSS didn't really exist, or it wasn't widely supported, so the only really effective way of laying out content on a page in anything more than just a vertical layout with maybe some right or left aligned content, the only way to get a more complex layout than that was to use tables. And it's actually, and the reason that that was sort of frowned upon once CSS came along is because it conceptually didn't separate our layout from our structure code in the HTML. So CSS came along and dictated that all of your layout code should come in the CSS and not be dictated by the HTML itself. But unfortunately for a lot of people, thinking about laying out a page as a table is actually an easier way to think about it, if you think about it in terms of columns and rows of information. Okay, and this particular HTML element needs to take up this amount of columns by this amount of rows on a particular grid. So grid frameworks are a way of trying to bring back that way of defining a layout, but by still using it in CSS rather than using the HTML tables. So if I just take a look at one of these links here, I'm going to open up this Grid-Based Web Design Simplified. So this is a good Smashing Magazine article which kind of explains the approach to grid-based web design. Okay, and as you can see, as sort of demonstrated by this image, thinking about it conceptually, it's about thinking about the page as a grid, and your elements take up a certain number of grid locations. So they have, for example, this header would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns across and 1, 2, 3 rows high. Okay, so basically that's all there is. That's all there is to it in terms of thinking about it conceptually. Is you divide the web page up into a grid of rows and columns, and you position your items based on the number of columns and rows that they take up. So in order to do this, generally what we have is, and this is a good article to read through as a primer on grid-based web design, but I'll let you do that in your own time. Essentially, the way that this works is you download some CSS files which define a bunch of classes which you can then apply to your HTML elements that will tell them to take up a certain number of grid positions on the grid. So a very early popular implementation of this was the 960 grid system. Okay, and essentially the idea behind the 960 grid system was that you would have a 12-column grid that is 960 pixels wide, because back then that was kind of the suggested width that you make your website so it appears nicely on all different sizes of desktop monitor. Okay, so this was before the era of responsive design, but this was kind of the first popular grid framework. So essentially what you had is a 12-column grid, and if you wanted a particular element to take up half the width, then you'd say make it take up 6 columns. Okay, if you wanted to take up 1/12 of the width, you'd say make it take up 12 columns. If you wanted to take up 100% of the width, you tell it to take up all 12 columns. Okay, this is probably not used that much anymore because it doesn't allow you to have responsive, adaptive or fluid grids. So the successor to the 960 grid system is this one called Unsemantic, which essentially took the same idea, but just instead of defining the column sizes in fixed number of pixels, it changed it to defining their widths as a relative unit of measurement, like percentage. So in this case, instead of saying you want it to take up one column, basically what they do is they divide the page up into 20 columns of a minimum 5% width, and you tell it to take up, if you want it to be 35% of the width, you tell it to take up 35 of those columns. And pretty much all other grid systems, monogrid systems, work this way. If you look at the demo, okay, these demos are a good visual way of explaining how this works, and you can see that essentially this is all different combinations of taking up certain number of columns. And because this is a fluid grid, if we size the page down, oops. If we size the page down, you'll notice that the columns collapse, but they maintain their ratio between each other. What you'll also notice is that it also includes a certain breakpoint where any columns that essentially you define column widths at a desktop width, but once the page gets small enough to what they essentially determine is a mobile device, although you could probably say this is tablet as well, it basically changes everything to a maximum of 2-column view. Okay, so it has a way of sort of automatically for you relaying out your content so that it should hopefully look nice on a mobile display without you having to then go and define extra media queries and change the layout yourself. Okay, so the benefit you get by that is you have to write a lot less of your own code. The drawback is that it's slightly less flexible because you may have a layout where you don't want it to actually collapse to just 2 columns, 2 equal columns at that particular breakpoint. But most of these have ways of kind of making that more flexible. And as with any of the things that I'm going to show you today, just because they offer some functionality doesn't mean that you have to use it. So you might use the grid at one point, but there's nothing to stop you writing your own media queries to redefine the layout at a different point, different to what the grid would dictate. Okay, so that's the unsemantic grid. The one I'm actually going to demonstrate, though, is Twitter Bootstrap. So Twitter Bootstrap essentially combines a grid framework with then a bunch of other stuff on top of that. Okay, but if you decide after looking at this that you like the idea of a grid, but you don't really want any of the extra stuff that Bootstrap offers you, then perhaps something like Unsemantic, which is just a grid framework, would work better for you. But that's completely up to you. And I've been asked in previous classes, because we're learning this, does this necessarily mean that we have to use it in the assignment? And that's definitely no, you don't have to. But I'm showing this to you so hopefully you can get an idea of whether or not it might be useful for you in your assignment. And so hopefully today and this week you can play around with it and get an idea of that before you actually go into the actual development of it. Okay, so we'll look at Twitter Bootstrap now. Now, this is something that I actually have to update on this post as well. So the link from this Twitter Bootstrap here actually links to an old version of Bootstrap. As you can see up here, version 2.3.2. But if you just simply get rid of that and just go to the URL getbootstrap.com, okay, that will show you the most recent version. So Bootstrap is a framework that, as I said, includes a grid framework, but then also other things on top of that which we could call web components. So usually navigation elements or interface elements that are pre-built for us. And they're and the two parts are quite separate. You could use one completely independently of the other, and I'm going to discuss them reasonably separately. It was made, the reason it's called Twitter Bootstrap is because the Twitter developers made this for use on the Twitter website itself, and then kind of gave it away to let anyone else use it if they wanted also. And a lot of people use it for, even if they don't end up using it on the final web project, a lot of people just use it for rapid prototyping because it allows you to quickly mock up an interface with interface elements in the browser that you can then decide, once you've decided the branding, what the look and feel will be, and you might implement it some other way. Okay, so I guess the first thing to look at is downloading Bootstrap. So there's a link straight on the main page here, and it links you to this other section here. And the files that you want to get are this first one here, the download Bootstrap. And I'll just download these and again open it up and show you what it looks like. So I'll extract that zip file and close that. And then I will open up the Bootstrap folder. Okay, and as you can see again, it's essentially just a bunch of different files already provided for you. There's some CSS files. Okay, and really there's only two of these that you will ever include. Okay, there's bootstrap.css and there's bootstrap-theme.css. Bootstrap theme simply allows you to it has a bunch of pre-built, I guess you could almost call them color themes that you can apply to different interface components. But these other files here, this bootstrap.min.css, it's simply the same file as this bootstrap.css, but it's what we call minified, which just means that if we look at the unminified version versus the minified version, all it's done is it's taken out all of the spaces, an extra white space, to just make the file a bit smaller. Okay, so that's a process that we often do to a lot of files in our web design projects, and I'll probably do a lecture later on about that stuff. But we won't worry too much about it now, other than to say these two files, bootstrap.css and bootstrap.min.css, should be functionally identical. It's just that one's smaller than the other, but obviously not easy to read. If you actually want to go and look through the code, you look at the unminified version. Okay, and this bootstrap.css.map file is it's simply a way for when we inspect a page using our inspection tools. If we are using the minified version, it will, and we're looking at the line that the particular code is pointing to, it will actually map it so it points back to the readable unminified version. Okay, but really, in summary, that you don't need to worry about that all too much, because yeah, it's a different editor. It's one I've been using for a while. There's no free version of it, but you can get a student version for about $29, which is a steal because I find it a really good editor. Yeah, I mean these are just files. So Bootstrap, there's nothing magical about Bootstrap. It's just a bunch of CSS and JavaScript files. That's it. Okay, so all you really need to know is that you need to include probably the Bootstrap file, either the Bootstrap min or bootstrap.css, and either Bootstrap theme or .css or Bootstrap theme min.css. Okay, so they're really the only two CSS files that you need to include to get to access all the functionality of Bootstrap. Okay, and then we've got a fonts folder. Okay, and you'll notice again these are all essentially the same thing. There's just different file formats. Okay, so this is a custom font full of what we call glyph icons, which I'll explain in a moment, and just so that they're compatible across all browsers, because they haven't really standardized a web font format for all browsers yet. It includes all different formats of them. If I go back to the Bootstrap page and I look at the component section here, the glyph icons are these things. So essentially it's a font, but rather than representing characters, it represents icons. Okay, so you can include any of these images simply by applying a class to your to any of your HTML elements, and it will output these as a font. And I'll demonstrate that in a bit and explain why they do it as a font a bit later as well. But that's the reason for the fonts being included there. And then you've got some JavaScript files, which actually, if all you want to use is the grid system, you don't actually need any JavaScript. It's the extra, it's some of the extra stuff on top of the grid system that requires JavaScript. So again, I'll explain this in more detail after I talk about the grid system. But again, if you look on the website, the Bootstrap website, there's a section of components. So you can see here, this demonstrates all of the pre-built interface components that you can use. Okay, and there's also a section called JavaScript, which is actually just extra components on top of that, but these components actually require JavaScript to operate properly. Okay, and probably the easiest one to demonstrate why that's the case is something like the modal component. So here's a demo of the modal component here, and what it does is it allows you to say when a button is, or when some element is clicked on, show what we call a modal window over here. So a modal window is something that takes over the whole display and shows something like that. When you get an error message on a program, okay, we call that a modal window. So this is a modal type window that Bootstrap has predefined. So without having to write any of the HTML or CSS or JavaScript code for this, as long as you set up your code in the way that they demonstrate here, you get functionality like this. Now the reason that this requires JavaScript is simply just because it's triggered by interaction. So the JavaScript, it needs JavaScript to be able to detect when we've clicked on an item. Okay, so if you want to use any of the components that are listed in this JavaScript section, then you do need to include these three, sorry, not this one. You don't need to worry about this npm.js. That's for its internal version management again. All you need to do is include either the bootstrap.js or the minified version of it. Unfortunately, they don't give you a starter index.html file as part of the download, but if you go back to the Getting Started section of the Bootstrap page and you scroll down to this section called Basic Template, okay, if you simply just copy and paste this code here as part of, and make that your HTML, your index.html page, then that should include everything that you need. So what I'll do is I'll go back in here and I'll create a new HTML file, call it whatever I want. I'll just call it index.html. Alright, and I will paste that example starter template there. Okay, so if we go through this, again, they've set up some meta tags in the head section. They've set up the mobile viewport because Bootstrap is a responsive grid system. Okay, so they've set up the viewport tag so that it appears correctly on when viewed on mobile displays. It's got a title, but the important things here is, one, it links to the Bootstrap CSS file, and two, it links to the Bootstrap JS file as well. Okay, now the other things to note here is Bootstrap is actually built on top of the jQuery JavaScript library, which again we'll get to that. We'll start looking at that a little bit later. But that's all this is doing here. This is including the jQuery library before including the Bootstrap files, the Bootstrap JavaScript file, because the Bootstrap JavaScript files rely on code that's in the jQuery library. Okay, but you really don't need to worry about jQuery for now in order to use Bootstrap, other than to know that Bootstrap's files need jQuery in order to work. Okay, and then there's just some other stuff here. This section here is simply just a way of, because Bootstrap uses reasonably modern HTML5 code, these JavaScript files here are simply a way of getting that modern code to work correctly on older versions of Internet Explorer. Okay, but again, you don't really need to worry about that so much. So if you just start off with this file, okay, you can just start writing your own code in the body section of the page here. And now, as these files stand here now with this index.html file, I've actually on the blog provided you with a link where you can download the Bootstrap plus that index.html file. So if
we supposed to be using HTML for our mockups, or can we use mock it up in Photoshop?
For the first assignment,
yeah.
No, you can use whatever you want. You can mock it up in the browser if you want, but go crazy, use Photoshop, Illustrator, or whatever.
We just have to show an image.
Yeah. Show an image, and I guess describe any animation or interaction that it might have. So if you scroll down to where I've got the exercises, and under exercise 2 there's a link here which says this start a Bootstrap project I've created for you. Essentially all that is the Bootstrap download plus this index.html file. So if you want to download that with this already included, that's where you can get that off my blog. But that's all I've done. I downloaded the Bootstrap files and then included the suggested basic template from the Bootstrap documentation site. Underneath here there's examples that might be worth looking at as well, which show you the kind of things that you can do with Bootstrap, from something very simple, okay, like this, which is just a navigation with some content, down to this, which demonstrates a bunch of the different themable components, so buttons, tables, image thumbnails, all sorts of stuff like that, and more complex examples as well. Okay, so all of these will have been created not by creating our own CSS necessarily, but simply by applying classes that Bootstrap already provides for us in the Bootstrap CSS in order to style particular components a particular way. Alright, so before I get too far ahead of myself, let's go back for a moment and look specifically at the Bootstrap grid framework. So you can find the documentation about the Bootstrap grid framework under the CSS section of getbootstrap.com. Okay, and well, firstly here it explains a bit about what you need to put inside of your HTML file. Okay, but all of this stuff is included in that basic template. Okay, and it talks about it talks about how you need to set certain things up. So one of the first things that you need to do with any Bootstrap website is make sure that you include all of your other content in some div that it has a class of either container or container fluid. And I'll try and explain the difference between those as I demonstrate the grid. Okay, but just know that any other code that you want to put inside here, if you want it to behave correctly within the grid system, it needs to be included in an element with a class of container or container fluid. Now I come to the grid system itself. Okay, so as it says here, Bootstrap includes a responsive mobile-first fluid grid system that scales up to 12 columns as the device or viewport size increases. Okay, so and it shows here it sets some predefined media queries to determine where those breakpoints happen. But probably the most useful part of this to show you what the different options are for columns is this table here. So essentially, what you do is you apply a class which determines the number of columns that a particular element needs to take up on the grid. But as you can see, you can apply these different classes for the different breakpoints, large, medium, small, and extra small, so that you can tell it to use a different number of columns for items at various different breakpoints. So I'll try and demonstrate that. There's a lot of examples here that are really good, but I'll try and demonstrate some of these as I go. There's another file which I've got at the bottom of this initial post which says you can download the code I used to demonstrate Bootstrap's grid examples here. Now this again is simply just the Bootstrap starter files that we already looked at, plus the basic index.html template, but then on top of that I've also included, if I just open these up here, okay, so the only difference here is I've added my own CSS file, main.css, and I've added this CSS style here, which is the same one that is used by these examples here in order to basically color the grid, so it's easier to see where the column divisions change up. So all this CSS is doing here is essentially saying any element that has a class starting with col dash, which any element that defines a column width will have, okay, apply this style, which is essentially adding a purple background, a border, and making it a certain size. Okay, so that's just so that we can visualize them. So if I go back into my index.html here now, and I've already got my container fluid class here, I can start defining my rows and columns in here. So any time where I want to have columns, I have to have that enclosed in a parent container that has a class of row. So I'll make a div here, and I'll give it the class of row, and then inside of this I can start defining my own columns. So let's just say I have a paragraph here, and let's put some just placeholder text there, and I'll open this up in the browser to see what it looks like. Okay, so at the moment it just looks like a paragraph of text, nothing unusual there. Okay, what I'm going to do now is apply to this paragraph a class of col dash. Let's start at the medium, md dash, and then a number between 1 and 12, saying how many columns I want it to take up. So if I want it to take up the full width of this row, I'll put in 12. Okay, go back here, okay, and now this is being styled with that column, all right, and it's got the purple background in the border so we can easily see how much space it's taking up. All right, and it's responsive, so as I move down here, okay, it's still taking up those 12 columns. So with one full width column, that doesn't, I mean, it's unnecessary to do that. I could have just had the paragraph there, but obviously this becomes more useful if I have, let's say, another paragraph here. And if, let's say, I want each of these to take up half of the grid width, then I'll tell them to take up six columns each. Okay, and there you can see they're laid out like that. So rather than me having to create my own CSS for these particular paragraphs and saying make it 50% and this one 50% and float this left and float this right, okay, I can simply just use the Bootstrap's predefined grid classes here. All right, and I can make this any combination of widths from 1 to 12. So let's say I wanted, say, it to look like this being a smaller sidebar and this being a larger main content section. Okay, and let's just say I want this to take up a quarter and then that to take up the other 3/4. So to take up a quarter of the space, I just need to figure out what a quarter of 12 is, which is 3. And then 3/4 of 12 will be the remaining 9 columns. Okay, and now I have my columns look like this. Now you wouldn't necessarily have the background showing on this. Okay, so normally you use the columns to lay things out just spatially. The only reason I've got this there is to make it a bit easier to see where the columns are actually sitting. Now there's no reason that you have to use up all 12 columns. We could, for example, make one of these 3 columns and the other one 4 columns. Okay, and it will just make up as many as it wants to be there.
And it will always float them together.
Yeah, will always. Well, it will always, unless you tell it otherwise, it will always put them together. But you can actually, we could move that one across. Okay, there's an example on the Bootstrap site. Let me make that separate. Okay, so there's a section here about offsetting columns. So we can do something like this by saying, all right, let's just say we want the columns to be this size, but I want this one to sit further over here. Okay, we can use this class called column md offset, and then tell it the number of columns we want to offset by. So if I want to push it 1 column over, I make it 1, and then it sits 1 over there. Okay, so there's all sorts of things you can do to make the layout actually really quite flexible. All right, so before we kind of get too far ahead of ourselves, okay, let's go up. I'm just going to copy the code from this example here. Okay, so this here now is 1, 2, 3, 4 rows, and inside each of those they have different numbers of columns that all add up to 12. Okay, so it looks like this. Now these are all specified at the medium breakpoint, which again, if we refer back to this table here, okay, the medium breakpoint is devices that are anything up to 992 pixels in width. So what I want you to notice here is as I size this down, when it hits that breakpoint, okay, it's collapsing everything to a single row of columns. Okay, so it's basically making that decision by default for us that if it gets below the point where I've defined these columns, it will always collapse down to one set of vertically stacked columns. Now that doesn't mean we have to accept that behavior. If we want to override that, all right, and let's just do it with this second row here. Okay, what I can do is with this second row, let's say I want to keep this as an 8 and 4 column split all the way down to the second smallest breakpoint, and then finally stack vertically at the smallest one. So I can change this from medium to small. Okay, and notice how, if I refresh that, now when I shrink down and hit that breakpoint, even though all of those other rows will collapse to a vertical, oops, I have to find them. Let me delete this first one so it's a bit easier to see. Ah, I did. Okay, thank you for pointing that out. Okay, I changed the text and not the actual class itself. Okay. Alright, so now that's working correctly. So, at above the medium breakpoint, everything is how it's defined. As soon as I hit smaller than that medium breakpoint, everything that's defined as column medium will collapse down to one vertical row. Okay, but the ones I've got defined as column small will maintain their column split like that until I get down to the extra small breakpoint, which I think is like 768 pixels, in which case they too will collapse down. All right, if I want to maintain this all the way down to even the smallest device, okay, then I change this from small to extra small. Okay, and now it will maintain it as small as I go. Okay, that's as small as I can actually resize my browser window. So hopefully you can see here, basically the smallest breakpoint that you assign it to gets applied to the larger breakpoints. Okay, unless you override them. So what I could do is say, well, at the smaller size, make them two 6-width columns. All right, let's just remove that so it's not confusing. But then I could say once it gets up to the medium breakpoint, or sorry, the small breakpoint, let's make that split, let's say 4 and 8. Okay, then at my smaller size, sorry, I made that 4 and 4, that should be 4 and 8. Okay, so now at my smaller size, I've got two 6-column widths. When I jump up to the next smallest size, okay, it takes on this one here. If I hadn't specified anything for here, it would keep the smallest one. And then you can keep going up and re-specifying them. I can, for example, say, well, at the next breakpoint up, I want it to be the same, so I don't need to override it. But once I get to the largest breakpoint, let's make it column LG1 and column LG12, sorry, 11. Okay, so now we go from 2 6s to a 4 and an 8 to a 4 and an 8 again, okay, because I haven't specified anything for the medium. to then a 1 and an 11 at the largest. So you can see you can be quite flexible on defining your different layouts if you need them to lay out different column sizes at those different breakpoints, okay? And you've got 4 different breakpoints to work with there, which are defined by this table here. And it tells you the column prefix that you need to use for each one of those. XS for X for small, SM for small, MD for medium, and LG for large. Okay, what else? Yes, I should explain the difference between a fluid container and a non-fluid container. So, on the same example here, okay, my container being the entire width of the page, notice how that everything shrinks down until you get to the breakpoint and it's kind of a smooth transition between. Okay, so that's what we call the fluid container. If I change this from container fluid to just container, right, then notice that it actually sizes the container specifically to these different breakpoints specified here. All right, and then rather than sizing the container itself, it just fills the rest of the space with margin, and then it jumps down to the next breakpoint. Okay, so I guess what you could call this is a responsive but not fluid layout. Okay, generally I always use container fluid because I like my content to expand to the amount of space it's available to it, but you've got that option there as if you want to use fixed width yet still responsive layouts. Okay, so there's more examples on using the different breakpoint columns here. So the good thing about the Bootstrap documentation is they have lots of example code that you can go on and use and edit. Column wrapping is pretty much just saying, well, if you have a bunch of columns and they take up more than the 12, they're just going to wrap down underneath, which you would expect is the behavior that you want. Offsetting columns, okay, we talked about that. That's how, if you want them to not necessarily sit side by side but still take up a certain number of columns, you use the column and then the breakpoint size offset and then the number of columns you want to offset by. Nesting columns, so you can actually, if you want to, you can nest columns within each other. So what I can do is have, let's pare this back to just a 6 and 6 column layout. Okay, so 250% columns. What I can do is inside of one of these, so let's take this first one here, I can create a new row, and inside of that I can start, inside of that row I can start another 12 column grid, which is inside of itself a 6 column grid. Okay, so in here I can then go and have div yeah, so essentially you're starting a new 12 column grid inside of that. Okay, so you can actually get down to really small divisions. Okay, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Need one more. Okay, so now this column here has another row embedded inside it, which itself now has a 12 column grid. So that way you can do things like having one set of columns to define sort of the big layout of your page. Maybe you have the sidebar and the main content, and then maybe inside the main content you want to split the content up into more columns there. Okay, so you do that by having nested columns. Column ordering is probably not something that you're going to need to use that much, but essentially what it allows you to do is the default order of the columns is the order that the column is written in the code. If you want to reverse that, you can use these push and pull classes in order to flip that around. So in this example, without these push and pull classes, the 9 width column would appear first, followed by the 3. Whoops. You add the push and pull classes, and it simply just reverses the order in those columns. So I'd say that's fairly rare that you need to come across that. Mostly you could just reorder the code so that it appear in the correct order, but there may be a situation where you want to do that. Perhaps you want to have say a sidebar on one side at one breakpoint and then flip it around the other side at another breakpoint. So in that case, you can't necessarily change the HTML, but you can change the push and pull classes so that they appear differently. It's probably not something that you will need to do that often, but that functionality is there.
Does the grid layout remove CSS position, essentially, or?
Well,
It's supposed to be faster than using CSS, or?
It's faster in terms of development time. You have to write less CSS code yourself. But again, there's nothing to say that you can't combine your own CSS positioning with the grid. So maybe there's a scenario where you use the grid to do the main layout of the big stuff, but then inside of something else you use your own CSS positioning to lay something out within a certain grid item. So you can mix and match and use it where it's useful and not use it where it's not useful. But if you look at any of the if you inspect any of the code for these, you'll notice that essentially the way that it's doing this grid stuff is by essentially doing what you would otherwise do anyway if you were creating this layout yourself. So this 6 width column is giving a 50% width, and it's telling it to float left. Okay, but it's also doing things like handling the collapsing divs. It's automatically handling that for you, so you don't have to worry about your collapsing divs when you're floating things. And it's positioning things relative. So I dare say, I haven't looked into it specifically, but the offsetting of the columns would be using position relative with say a left value of X number of columns. So everything that's going on behind the scenes is just CSS. It's just that and that's all it is. All the bootstrap.css is a bunch of classes, and if you look through them, you'll find all of these column classes that we're using in the CSS here, and you can see the CSS that it's using. So there's nothing really magical going on here. We're just using the CSS that's already been written, rather than having to write it all ourselves. So that's pretty much all there is to the grid system. It would be good to have a play around with that, look at these examples, because as much as I can attempt to describe how it works to you, there's probably no better way of figuring it out than actually just playing around with it, pulling in and putting out those column classes and seeing how it affects the layout. So that actually brings me to the first example that I want you to do. So I've got, or the first exercise. I've got 2 exercises here, and they're both related to Bootstrap. So the first one is, again, using a similar layout to the one that we've done before. And again, you can, so for this exercise, if you don't want to go through the whole process of downloading Bootstrap yourself and setting up the HTML file, you can download the starter project here, which again is just the Bootstrap files, plus I've plugged in the HTML from the previous week's example, slightly modified to work with Bootstrap here. So if you download that, it should download and extract to a folder called Bootstrap Exercise. I'll just close that one. Okay, so Bootstrap exercise contains all of the Bootstrap files. Again, I've added a main.css file in here, which has some of the styling required for that layout. Okay, so this one here. And there's an index.html file, and I've actually included the complete version of the example for you here. Try and avoid looking at it, have a go yourself, but I've included it there so you can at least open it up in the browser to see how the responsive layout works, or how at least my solution for it works in Bootstrap. So you notice it's a little bit different. It's a little bit different to the previous week's example when we did the responsive layout ourselves, due in some part to some of the things that Bootstrap sort of forces you into doing. So things like Bootstrap decides that it will have like a 15 pixel gutter or gap between columns, so you'll notice that that's what exists here and here and here and here. Also, because I've used a navigation component here, I haven't, at the largest breakpoint, put the navigation here. This navigation component on the completed example, though, you can see how much sort of you get for free. I've simply included the navigation component based on the example and written the classes in there, and just by doing that I get a horizontal menu that at a certain breakpoint collapses down to a mobile menu, and I get this nice functionality here like that. Now I've included that even in the incomplete example. I've opened that in the page because I don't want this example necessarily to be about anything other than the Bootstrap grid. So you notice the incomplete example is fluid. Okay, I've already put the CSS in there to make my images, for example, have a max width of 100%, so they're sized down nicely. There's the completed Bootstrap navigation bar, which is completely functional. Okay, but what I want you to do is apply the row and column classes where relevant in order to make the layout be nicely responsive. So as you can see here, there's no change to the number of columns I have here, and there's no change to the overall layout in terms of having a main content and a sidebar section. And also this section up here, okay, I've done that in the completed example also with Bootstrap columns. So if maybe I just demonstrate that first part and then you can go on with the rest of it, the way that I would attack that. Okay, so if I'm talking about just this logo and the site title here. Okay, so that represents my header section. Notice I've already put everything in a container fluid for you. Okay, so now I'm just looking at the header section here. So what I'm going to do, looking at this just conceptually for a moment, if I make that whole header a row, then I can make that a certain number of columns and that a certain number of columns, and they should sit nicely side by side. Okay, so first of all I make my header, which contains those elements, a row, and then what I can do is my two elements that I want to position as columns are essentially this anchor tag which surrounds the logo and the image, and then my other column will be the span, which itself contains the heading 1 for the site title. So what I will do is this anchor tag, I'm going to, okay, it's already got a class of logo, I'm just going to add on to that a class of column. And because I want these to sit side by side no matter how small the device is, I'm going to use the extra small breakpoint. So column XS, and I need to decide how many columns width of this row I want it to take up. So let's just say I want it to be 25% and 75%. Okay, so then that will be 1/4 of 12 is 3 columns for the logo. And then I'll go down here to the span and add the class here, column XS, and have it take up the remaining 3/4 of the width, which will be 9 columns. And then I jump back over and refresh. Okay, and now it nicely takes up that amount of space. And again, I can inspect my code here, and I can highlight over each of these and see, because it's a bit hard when there's white space to see actually how much space they're taking up. But if I hover over that anchor tag, the A tag that's containing the logo, okay, I can see that that's taking up, that looks to me 25% of the width, and then the span down below is taking up the other 75% of the width. Okay, and I've done that using the Bootstrap's column classes without having to style that myself. So what I want you to do is go through the rest of the code and figure out how to lay it out responsively like we did last week. But rather than writing your own CSS, all I want you to do is apply Bootstrap's row and column classes. Now I've left, in a lot of these cases, I've left the class declarations in there, so it gives you an idea of where you need to put the row and the columns. Okay, but the sort of things you want to do is, I'd say on the large breakpoint, you'd want to make your main content and the sidebar sit there, and then tackle having a nested row in here where you make these 4 columns again, and then you can adjust that at the different breakpoints if you want. So you should find that you actually don't need to add a single line of CSS. And what'll be interesting is once you complete this exercise, go back and compare to the last week's exercise and actually see how much less code you needed to write by using Bootstrap's grid framework rather than coding it all the CSS yourself. So the only things you really should need to add are row classes and column classes to the HTML, and you should be able to make a completely responsive layout. So that's one exercise. The other exercise I want you to do is essentially just play around with Bootstrap's components. So this is all of the extra stuff on top of the grid system. So I should demonstrate a little bit of that as well. Okay, let's just close these down. Like that. All right, so back to the Bootstrap website. So putting the grid stuff aside for a moment, let's look at the other stuff inside of Bootstrap. So if I'm looking in the CSS section, and I'll demonstrate one of the simpler things first. Okay, so something like buttons here. Okay, so you can see they have some freestyle buttons for you, which you can then go and modify. And again, the way that we get them to look like this is simply by using inbuilt classes that Bootstrap has. So if I just grab a Alright, well, what I'm going to do is download from my blog the Bootstrap starter project again. So just an empty Bootstrap project. Download that here. Okay, and that extracts to a folder called new Bootstrap project. So that's the one that has nothing more than Bootstrap's files itself. Okay, it's got Bootstrap's files itself, plus the basic index.html template, plus a main.css file with nothing in it, but already linked up. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, if I want a button here, I can use the HTML5 button element. Okay, and I can now if I just have the button element, what I'm going to get when I look at this page, okay, is simply my browser's default way of styling the button. Okay, now the simplest version of the Bootstrap button I get by adding a class of btn. Alright, in which case you see it gets changed and it looks something like this. And if we scroll down a bit, I can see I can get all of these different looks for that button by adding, in addition to the btn class, another class that is btn dash and then some name. So if I add btn dash default, okay, I get a very plain button that looks like this, but you can see it's already got its hover and clicks styles defined. And if I want any of these other ones, I simply just use whichever class is relevant to it. So they essentially have named the classes here based on the semantic use of the button. Okay, so they have primary, which is kind of like the most highlighted one, a success button, which is green, an info button, which is kind of light blue, a warning button, which is orange, and a danger button, which is red. So I can make my button look like any of those by using the appropriate class. So I can make btn primary, okay, and I get the primary button. I can get the danger button. Oops. Okay, and I get that, and again, I'm getting this all for free without having to write any of my own CSS. Now, let's just say you like the basic style of this button, but there's a color that you want to use. Maybe none of those colors fit your branding. Maybe you like the danger button, but you don't like that exact shade of red. So as I said before, just because there's all of this stuff in Bootstrap doesn't mean, A, that you have to use it. You could go and design your own button in CSS yourself and use that. But also, there's nothing to stop you from overriding certain styles. So maybe I like everything about that danger button, I just don't like the particular shade of red that it uses. So there's nothing to stop me from overriding that. If I look at, there's my example here. Okay, if I look at my little button here and I inspect it to see what's going on behind the scenes with the CSS, okay, you'll notice that there's my two classes that have been applied here. And hopefully this will make sense as to why. You'll notice that in Bootstrap, generally you apply more than one class at a time, and there's a good reason that they've split their classes up like this. Okay, and that's to make it more easily extensible by you. It's to make it more easily modifiable by you. So the reason that this requires two classes, btn and also btn danger, if we look at the code here, you can see the different parts of the CSS that this stuff controls. So essentially what the btn class does is it sets up a default look for that button that doesn't specify anything much more than the shape of it, and the positioning of it. Okay, and then these other classes on top of that add things that you would consider more branding or more visual style. So things like the color. So what that means is if I want to change the color, I don't have to go and redefine this entire class. I can just redefine, I don't have to go and redefine all of my buttons. I can just redefine the danger button. So there's nothing to stop me going into my CSS file and overriding that class, that .btn-danger. Make that bigger. Okay, and seeing this, now I could either go searching for this in the bootstrap.css, okay, to find out the CSS styles for it here, but I actually find it easier to just inspect it in the web browser, so I don't have to go trawling through the code. And then all I really need to do is override these styles here. So let's just say the only one that I really want to override is this background color. Then all I have to do is go into my custom CSS file, set the background color to be, well, let's start off with very red. Okay, and I'll select something that looks different enough so that the change is obvious. Let's say I make it, well, let's make it really bright. That should make it obvious enough. Okay, so now I've kept all of the other styles, but I've overwritten the background color for the BTN Danger. So now if I go back here and I refresh this, okay, hopefully we should see that the color for that changes. Hopefully enough that we can recognize it. So I'll refresh, okay, and you can see hopefully that's become a bit brighter. If we go back again and inspect over here what's going on now, you can see that the BTN style from Bootstrap is still being applied, as is the BTN Danger, except that that background color is being overwritten by the background color that I've defined. And the reason that it's choosing mine over the Bootstrap one, okay, if we remember back to CSS specificity, these have the exact same specificity. Okay, so the reason that it's choosing this one over this one is because my definition comes further along in the code. And that is because, if I go back to my index.html file, it's very important that my inclusion of my CSS file comes after the inclusion of the Bootstrap file. Okay, so generally you always want to include your framework CSS declaration first, and then your own CSS declaration after. Okay, if I had have included mine first, then Bootstrap's one, then it would preference the Bootstrap one, and my customization would have no effect. Okay, and then so that's what we can do. I could even, if I wanted, make my own button style entirely. So I could, for example, say make a style called BTN, and just so I know that there's nothing that's going to be in Bootstrap, I'll call this BTN Dave, and I'll set the background color to be, let's say, yellow, and I'll set the font color to be, let's make it white. Okay, and now I can apply that instead of BTN Danger. Okay, and I get a horrible looking button, but it's the one that I've defined. Okay, now, so hopefully that demonstrates to you that a lot of people see that and they go, well, ooh, yeah, it looks good, but I don't necessarily want it to look exactly what it looks like. Okay, you can customize where it's relevant to make things look how you want, and as I said, you can use what's relevant to you and ignore the rest. Okay, there's no reason that just because there's something in there that you have to use it. There's nothing to stop you from combining Bootstrap styles with then your own CSS. Okay, and there's usually heaps of other things that you can use to modify this. So for example, we can add then another set of classes that tells how big we want the button to be. So the default is sort of this size, but then I can make a large or a small one by, set this back to BTN primary. Okay, so if I want it to be bigger, I can set it to BTN LG, short for large. Okay, or I can make it smaller, and it'll make a smaller button. Okay, so, all right, so that's buttons. Okay, I think we've covered enough about buttons, but that's probably the most simple example of all of the Bootstrap components, but they all essentially follow that. They require that you set your HTML up in a certain way, and then that you apply a certain class, and then you get all of the predefined styling that Bootstrap offers you. So you can see there's even more classes that allow you to adjust the way that it actually lays out or how they join together, all these sorts of things. A more complex example would be if you went over into components here and had a look at the nav bar. Okay, and again, you can see how complex of a layout you can generate without writing any CSS, as long as you apply the appropriate classes to your HTML and write it in such a way. So really all I want you to do with exercise 2 is simply just download Bootstrap yourself or use the starter Bootstrap project that I've created, and I just want you to experiment with Bootstrap components. So go through, copy and paste the code examples they have, play around with them, delete things, add things, see if you can modify them, just to kind of get a feel for how that works. Now the one last thing that I really want to show you is goes back to this whole thing as to why these glyph icons have been included as fonts. So the reason that that can be really useful is, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a span tag here, and just as a place for my glyph icon to appear. So I can use any of the icons that are demonstrated, okay, and you'll find these all at the top of components. I can get any of these to appear simply by using the class that's defined under all of these. So again, it's split up into two classes. You want to use the generic class glyph icon, which will set up some styling as to how it appears, and then a specific class which will determine which of the glyph icons is actually displayed. So let's just say I want to take this musical note, for example. Okay, to get that to display, all I need to do is on a particular HTML element, and I'm going to use a span just because it's empty, I don't really want any content in there. Okay, and we apply a class of glyph icon, and then a second class of glyph icon dash, and then the particular one that we want to display. So in this case, it's glyph icon dash music. And if I go back to my page and refresh, okay, there you can see there's the music icon that appears right next to it. Now, normally what I would suggest is the easiest way to do this is just to come to the this page here and just simply copy this and paste it into your class definition, and then you'll get that particular icon. Okay, so let's change it to this glyph icon euro symbol. Oops. Okay, so there's my euro symbol there now. Now the reason that they've done these as fonts and not just given you a whole bunch of images is for a couple of reasons. The first one is that a lot of the time you want to use your icons and you want to be able to essentially set them the same size as the text around it. Okay, so let's just say inside of this span that I have a thing that says 100 euros. Okay, now let's say I want this to be much, much bigger itself. So what I can do is I can put a style on this span class. And let's just add my own class called Big Euro. And let's set the font size to be something pretty big. Okay, and so you'll notice that they've scaled with each other. If that was an image rather than a font, I would have had to go and figure out the correct size to scale with that font and change that separately. Because it's a font, all I have to do is set it to the same font size as the text around it, and then they scale nicely together. And then the other good thing is, because it's a font, if I want to change the color, I simply just apply the color style, okay, and it will pick that up, so I can make it any color I want. Again, if this was an image, there's no easy way to change the color with CSS of an image. I would have to go and modify the image in Photoshop, change the color, and save it every single time I wanted to decide to change the color. So actually having these glyph icons as a font makes them actually really, really flexible. Okay, and you can even do things like you can even do things like this, where you include the icon as part of a button. Okay, so all we have to do that, so I'll use this same star icon. All I need to do is, okay, I've got my button here. If I want to include a glyph icon that actually appears inside the button, I'll just put another span inside of here, and I'll give it the class of glyph icon and glyph icon star. And again, it appears nicely beside that. If I want to have a bit more space there, I'll just put a space before that. Okay, but it appears nicely like that. And again, because it's a font, if I change this from being a, well, again, you'll notice because it's a font, it's using the same font color that the button's using. But again, if I change the button from a button large to a button small, without having to worry about the size of my image, because the glyph icon is a font, it gets nicely sized with it. So it might seem like a weird way to do it, but actually is really, really useful. Now on top of that, on top of the included glyph icons, you can actually expand upon those. There's a website called Font Awesome. So Font Awesome is essentially a site where people contribute or request that extra icons that don't exist in the Bootstrap. Sorry, I might have the URL wrong. Okay, that people request icons that don't exist in the default pack. Okay, so you can have a look at all of the icons here, but they're also done, and there's heaps of them, okay, but they're also done in the same way as fonts. Essentially, you download the font icon font, and then you apply them the same way, except instead of using a glyph icon class, I believe you use a class called FA, and then the specific class relating to the particular icon. So if you want to use, so this may be possibly relevant to your project. If you want to use sort of icon symbols a lot in your project, then an easy way of including those, rather than going and making the image yourself, might be to use something like an icon font set. And because it's a font, you get, and because fonts are defined as vectors, you'll notice that it doesn't matter how large you scale them. Unlike a bitmapped image, it will always maintain its sort of infinite resolution like that as well. So you get a lot of benefits by having images inside of symbols inside of fonts. Okay. What else? So I guess that's pretty much it when it comes to components. There's just heaps more of them, and there's different levels of complexity that you get. And as I said, some of them that are interactive require JavaScript. So you can look at those. So yeah, all I really want you to do for the second exercise is to get a Bootstrap project going, and then play around with some of these components and maybe get an idea of whether or not they might be useful, if not for your assignment. Again, I'm not dictating that you necessarily have to use any of this for your assignment, but if you explore it now, you might get an idea of what might be useful, but also what might be useful for any other web projects that you may do down the track. Okay, so I'll leave that there.